The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles still clung to the air when my son stood up from the Christmas table, his face red, his voice trembling with rage, and screamed at me to get out. "Get out, Mom! You're ruining Christmas for us!" He didn't whisper. He didn't hide it. He spat it like a command in front of everyone. For a second, I thought I had misheard. The golden lights twinkling on the Christmas tree behind him blurred through the tears that suddenly filled my eyes. All around the table, forks and knives froze in midair. My grandson's laughter died in his throat, and I felt every pair of eyes settle on me, the old widow. The mother who had spent decades building this family, now treated like a stranger, intruding at her own table. I wish I could tell you that someone stood up for me. That one voice at that table said, "Wait, this is wrong." But no one did. My daughter-in-law looked at me with cold triumph and deliberately pushed my plate to the floor. The china shattered across the polished wooden boards, gravy splattering like blood. She smiled faintly as if she had been waiting for this moment. My son didn't flinch. He just stood there, jaw clenched, telling me again to leave. Do you know what it feels like when the child you carried in your body, the child you fed and sacrificed for, looks at you as if you are a burden, an obstacle, an enemy? I sat there in silence for a few seconds, hands trembling, my heart pounding louder than the Christmas music still playing faintly in the background, the smell of pine needles from the tree, the sweetness of baked pies on the counter, the sound of children whispering nervously, all of it wrapped around me like a cruel mockery. Christmas had always been sacred to me. It was the one night of the year I believed family should be together, no matter the differences. Yet here I was, being cast out of my own bloodline as if I were an intruder at my son's feast. My voice shook when I asked, "Ethan, is this really what you want?" He didn't even meet my eyes. He stared at the floor as though ashamed but unwilling to stop. My daughter-in-law, dressed in her glittering red dress, stepped closer, her tone dripping with poison. "A woman your age doesn't need so much space. You've been clinging to that apartment for too long. It's time you moved into something smaller, something more suitable. We need the room now. We have plans. You'll understand eventually." Her words echoed around the table, each syllable stabbing me deeper than the slap she had given me months before at her wedding. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg, but instead, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fireplace. I looked around at the faces of people I had once believed were my family, searching for even one trace of compassion. I found none. My son remained frozen, paralyzed by his wife's grip on his arm. My grandchildren stared at their plates. My brother-in-law coughed nervously but said nothing. And so, with my dignity in tatters, I walked to the door, my feet dragging across the carpet where my husband and I had once danced at Christmas parties long ago. Outside, the cold air bit into my cheeks like knives. Snowflakes fell softly, mocking the storm inside my chest. I wrapped my thin coat tighter around me, though it did little to warm the hollow space where my heart used to be. My hands trembled as I clutched my old purse, the same one I had carried for years, the same one my daughter-in-law always ridiculed. I could still hear the laughter from inside the house, as if my exile had been nothing more than an interlude before dessert. Standing there in the dark, on the edge of my son's perfect holiday picture, I realized something had shattered forever. That moment wasn't just about being thrown out into the snow. It wasn't about a ruined Christmas dinner. It was about betrayal so deep it left a scar on my soul. A son turning against his mother, a wife celebrating my humiliation, a family watching in silence. And yet, even as I stood trembling in the cold, a strange calm began to grow inside me. Because what they didn't know was that I was not as powerless as I looked. For years, I had hidden truths, protected secrets, lived simply to shield what really mattered. They thought they had reduced me to nothing more than an old woman clinging to her apartment. They thought they could strip me of dignity and home in one cruel gesture, but they were wrong, very wrong. I took one last glance at the glowing windows of the dining room where my family sat enjoying their feast without me. The warmth inside contrasted cruelly with the freezing silence outside, but I whispered to myself, "Let them laugh now. Let them think they've won." My hand shook as I pulled my phone from my purse. I dialed a number I hadn't used in months, my breath forming clouds in the icy air. When the voice answered, steady and professional, I said, "Mr. Collins, it's time. Bring the envelope to the house tonight. They need to hear the truth." My words trembled but carried a fire I hadn't felt in years. He hesitated only briefly before replying, "Are you sure? Once this is revealed, there's no going back." I closed my eyes, feeling tears freeze against my lashes, and whispered, "I've never been more sure." I hung up, slid the phone back into my purse, and stood a little taller. The snow swirled around me, and I thought of my late husband, the man who had always told me, "Dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you give it away." Tonight, I would take it back. Tonight, in front of every relative who had watched me be humiliated, I would rise. They had thrown me out of Christmas dinner, but the night was far from over. Because before the candles burned out, before the wine was finished, before the gifts were unwrapped, someone would walk through that door carrying the one thing my son and his wife feared most, the truth. And when the truth came, it would shatter their perfect little holiday and expose every lie, every betrayal, every ounce of greed they had tried to hide. I would no longer be the silent, humiliated mother sitting at the edge of the table. I would be the storm they never saw coming. The night I was pushed out into the snow was not born in a single moment of anger. No, betrayals of that scale are planted like seeds long before the harvest of humiliation. And if I am honest with myself, I had seen the first sprouts a year earlier, at the last Christmas dinner we had all shared together in this very house. Back then, my son still smiled when he saw me, or at least I thought the smile was genuine. My daughter-in-law had leaned across the table, her manicured nails tapping her wine glass, and said lightly, "Have you ever thought of moving to a smaller place, Aurora? It must be exhausting for you to maintain such a big apartment at your age." The words had slipped out like honey, but tasted of poison. I had laughed it off, telling her I loved my home and had no intention of leaving it. Ethan had chuckled awkwardly, changed the subject, and I told myself it was nothing, just a careless remark. But careless remarks have a way of multiplying. In the spring, I noticed something strange. When I invited them over for Sunday lunch, I caught a faint whiff of fresh paint on Ethan's jacket. It was not from my building. Later that afternoon, I overheard Juliet whispering into her phone while pretending to check her messages. "Yes, Mom, the location is perfect. Huge living room, plenty of light. Once she's ready to move out, we can—" She stopped abruptly when I entered the room. She smiled too brightly, slipped the phone back into her purse, and asked me about the roast as if nothing had happened. I felt a chill run down my spine even though the kitchen was warm from the oven's heat. Summer came, and with it, more little jabs. At a barbecue with friends, Juliet laughed about how I was still driving my 10-year-old car. "It's dangerous, don't you think? An old woman on the road in that thing. Imagine what could happen." Everyone chuckled politely, but I saw Ethan staring at the ground again, silent, unwilling to defend me. I forced a smile, but inside I felt the sting of her words like nettles under the skin. It was autumn when I began to truly understand. One afternoon, while I was watering my plants on the balcony, I noticed a man across the street holding a clipboard pointing up at my apartment. I squinted through the sun and recognized him as a real estate agent from the neighborhood. I had seen his picture on flyers stuffed under my door. He paced back and forth, jotting down notes, measuring angles with his eyes. Moments later, Juliet joined him. She wore oversized sunglasses, but I knew her figure, her sharp posture. She walked him around the block, gesturing toward my building, her lips moving quickly, eagerly. That night, when they came over for dinner, I asked casually, "Do you know a man named Harris? Works in real estate?" Ethan froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. Juliet answered smoothly, too smoothly, "Oh, I've seen his ads. Why?" I studied her carefully, but said nothing more. I pretended not to notice Ethan's nervous cough, the way he avoided my eyes. By November, the pressure began to tighten like a noose. Every conversation with Juliet circled back to my apartment. She brought magazines filled with smiling, gray-haired couples in retirement communities. She showed me glossy brochures of senior living residences with wide hallways and smiling nurses. "Doesn't it look wonderful, Aurora? 24-hour care, no stress, no stairs to climb. Imagine how peaceful it would be." I would nod politely, but each time my stomach twisted tighter. I began to feel like a pawn on a chessboard, moved carefully toward a checkmate I had not agreed to play. I noticed Ethan repeating her words, almost verbatim, as if he had been rehearsing. "Mom, Juliet has a point. The apartment is really too much for you. Wouldn't it be safer in a smaller place?" He said it with a forced gentleness, but the betrayal was in the very act of saying it. This was not my son speaking freely. This was my son echoing his wife's ambition. One evening, as the leaves turned and the first chill of winter crept into the air, I went to the kitchen to take out the trash. In the bin, buried under onion skins and coffee grounds, I saw a crumpled piece of paper. Something about the shape made me pause. I reached in, smoothed it out on the counter, and my blood ran cold. It was a preliminary contract, a template of sorts. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Transfer of Property Agreement." And though most of the spaces were blank, the address typed in was mine. I held that paper with trembling hands, staring at it until the letters blurred. I waited for Ethan to say something, to explain, but when I confronted him that evening, he only shrugged, muttered that it was just something Juliet had been looking into, and walked away. His tone was defensive, irritated, as though I were the one who had intruded. That was the first moment I knew. Not suspected, not feared, knew. My own child was preparing to push me out of my home, and once you know something like that, you cannot unknow it. I spent that night pacing my apartment, listening to the wind rattle the windows. My hands clenched so tightly they left half-moon marks in my palms. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corners seemed to whisper, "They are waiting. They are circling. They will not stop until you are gone." Looking back now, I realize round one was already the beginning of war. I just hadn't chosen to fight yet. I still clung to the fragile hope that Ethan would come to his senses, that the boy I had raised with lullabies and bedtime stories would remember who I was to him. But with every passing week, with every cold glance from Juliet, with every silence from Ethan, that hope dimmed. By the time the snow began to fall, by the time Christmas lights twinkled in every window on our street, I was already bracing myself. I didn't know exactly when the blade would fall, but I could feel it in the air, sharp and inevitable. And still, when it came, when they finally turned on me at the dinner table, it was like being struck by lightning. You can see the storm clouds gathering, but nothing can truly prepare you for the moment they split the sky. The first snow had barely settled on the rooftops when the second crack in my fragile illusion appeared, and this time it came from someone outside the family, someone who had no reason to lie to me. My neighbor, Mrs. Bennett, had lived across the hall for nearly 20 years. She was a widow, too, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who notices everything but rarely says much. One evening, she knocked gently on my door, her face lined with hesitation. "Aurora," she whispered, "I don't want to interfere, but I think you should know. I saw Ethan and Juliet last week." I smiled politely, trying to hide the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Of course you did. They visit often. She shook her head. No, not here. At the corner cafe with a man in a suit. He had property brochures spread across the table. I passed by twice, and each time they were leaning in, whispering. Her voice trembled. Aurora, they were looking at your building. I recognized the photo on the page. They're planning something. Her words struck like ice water down my spine. I thanked her, forced a smile, and closed the door. But inside I collapsed against the wall, my knees weak. The truth I had tried to bury was crawling out again, undeniable. That night, I barely slept. The shadows on my ceiling looked like vultures circling, waiting. I rose before dawn, my breath visible in the cold air of my apartment. I made coffee, but the bitterness only deepened the pit in my stomach. I thought of Juliet's honeyed words about senior living and Ethan's silence every time she cut me down. I realized Mrs. Bennet had only confirmed what I already knew. They were circling like wolves, sharpening their teeth. Days later, I received another blow. My friend Amelia, who worked in real estate, stopped by for tea. We had known each other since high school, and though we rarely spoke of business, that day she brought it up herself. Aurora, she said cautiously, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you planning to sell your apartment? The cup rattled in my hand. Sell? No. Why would I? She exchanged a look with me, her brow furrowed. Because I've received 3 calls in the last month from a young woman asking about the market value of your exact building. She described the floor plan, the balcony view. It could only be yours. When I asked her name, she hesitated, then hung up. But Aurora, I recognized her voice. It was Juliet. The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Amelia reached across, her hand warm over mine. I didn't want to believe it either, but she's not just curious, she's planning. I forced myself to breathe, to nod, to thank her. But inside, I felt something tearing open. For months, I had convinced myself Juliet's jabs were just cruelty, her obsession with my apartment just vanity. But now, the evidence piled higher. Real estate agents, phone calls, brochures. My home was already being treated as merchandise behind my back. That week, the air between Ethan and me grew heavier. He came by one evening with a forced smile and a bottle of wine. We sat at the table, and I asked him directly, Ethan, do you want my apartment? His face turned red. He laughed nervously. Mom, don't be dramatic. We just want what's best for you. What's best for me? I asked, my voice sharp. Or what's best for you? He looked away, swirling the wine in his glass, and I had my answer. The pressure escalated at Thanksgiving. We gathered in Juliet's parents' home, a lavish dining room filled with crystal glasses and the smell of roasted turkey. Juliet's mother raised her eyebrows at me, her tone falsely sweet. Aurora, dear, isn't it exhausting keeping up that big place all alone? My husband and I were just saying how wonderful it would be for you to enjoy a retirement community. People your age need support. Her husband chimed in, his booming voice echoing, yes, and Ethan and Juliet could finally start their family in a home big enough for children. It's only logical. The words struck me like blows. I looked at Ethan, waiting, begging silently for him to defend me. But he sat frozen, his fork idle, eyes down. He didn't say a word. My own son let strangers tell me to my face that my independence was over. The humiliation burned, but so did the realization. This was not just Juliet's idea anymore. It was a conspiracy, rehearsed lines spoken by her parents as if they were reading from a script. They had already chosen my future without me. After dinner, I excused myself and walked out into the cold night air, my breath clouding. The laughter from inside drifted through the window, muffled but cruel. I leaned against my car, trembling, and whispered to myself, "They will not stop until I am erased." When I returned home, I called Amelia again. My voice cracked as I asked her to dig deeper. Find out everything, Amelia. Debts, loans, whatever you can. I need to know why they are so desperate." Within a week, she delivered the news, and it chilled me to the bone. Ethan and Juliet were drowning. $50,000 in wedding loans, credit cards maxed to the limit, their rent overdue, their cars financed on payments they couldn't meet. Amelia's voice softened as she told me, "Aurora, your apartment isn't just desirable, it's their lifeline." I sat in silence, the report trembling in my hands. My son, my boy who once saved pennies in a jar to buy me a birthday gift, was now plotting to steal the roof over my head because he and his wife had spent themselves into ruin. That night, staring out at the snow falling gently past my window, I realized I was no longer imagining things. This was not paranoia. It was a siege. And every day that passed, the walls closed in tighter. Still, I told no one. I kept my silence, burying the humiliation deep in my chest. I smiled politely at church, nodded at neighbors, worked my shifts at the flower shop as if nothing were wrong. But inside, I was crumbling. Because what do you do when the people you love most are the ones sharpening the knife behind your back? It is one thing to suspect betrayal, to catch whispers in the dark and scraps of paper in the trash. It is another thing entirely to feel the walls of your own home closing in on you, to realize that the place you thought was a sanctuary has become the very stage for your humiliation. That was what the final weeks before Christmas felt like, an invisible trial where I was the defendant, judged guilty before I even opened my mouth. Ethan's words changed first. They no longer sounded like his own. Each sentence felt rehearsed, phrases I had already heard dripping from Juliet's tongue, now reappearing in his voice with uncanny precision. "Mom, you can't keep driving that old car. It's dangerous at your age. Mom, Juliet and I just want to make sure you're safe in case you fall. Mom, don't you think a retirement home would give you peace of mind?" Every time he said "Mom," I flinched because the voice was his, but the script was not. I began to dread their visits. What once had been moments of warmth, Sunday lunches and shared laughter, became interrogations. Juliet would walk around my apartment like an inspector, running her fingers along the windowsills, checking the kitchen cabinets, measuring the living room with her eyes. "So much space for one person," she would sigh, shaking her head. Imagine what this could be with a family inside. Ethan would nod silently beside her as though hypnotized, and I felt my chest tighten until I could hardly breathe. At night, I would sit in my armchair, the glow of the Christmas lights flickering against the walls, and wonder how my life had reached this point. My husband and I had once built dreams in this apartment. We had painted these very walls together, laughed while unpacking boxes, planned holidays with Ethan running through the hallways. Now those same walls echoed with the sound of my daughter-in-law's heels, a rhythm that made me feel like a tenant awaiting eviction. The sense of isolation grew sharper when the extended family began to echo the same chorus. At a Sunday dinner hosted by Juliet's parents, her father raised his glass and said, "It's not healthy for someone Aurora's age to live alone. She should be somewhere with proper care." The table murmured in agreement. I looked at Ethan, pleading silently with my eyes, but he avoided my gaze, staring into his wine. No one contradicted the lie. Worse still, some of my own relatives began to withdraw. My niece, once so affectionate, started to cancel our weekly visits. When I asked why, she hesitated, then admitted softly, "Juliet said you were struggling, Aunt Aurora. She said you might not be able to handle conversations anymore. I didn't want to upset you." My heart cracked at her words. Juliet was not only plotting to take my home, she was poisoning my reputation drip by drip until even my own blood doubted me. It was in those days that I began to feel like a ghost in my own life. I would speak and no one would hear. I would defend myself and no one would believe. I once walked into the living room to find Juliet showing Ethan a brochure of a luxury retirement residence. She looked up at me, her smile bright and false. "Isn't it beautiful, Aurora? daily activities, medical staff on site, even a piano room. You could make so many friends. Her tone was as if she were offering me a gift, not planning my exile. Ethan nodded, saying softly, "It would be good for you, Mom, really." Something inside me broke then. "Good for me?" I snapped, my voice rising for the first time in months. "Or good for you?" The room fell silent. Juliet's smile faltered for just a second, but Ethan's face hardened. "Why do you always have to be so difficult?" he muttered, his tone full of irritation, as though I were the problem. That night, alone in my bedroom, I pressed my face into my pillow to muffle the sobs. I cried not only for the betrayal, but for the silence, the terrible silence of those who should have defended me. Loneliness seeped into my bones like winter cold, and I wondered if this was how they meant to break me, not with violence or legal threats, but with relentless erosion until I surrendered. The holidays approached, and with them came more gatherings, more whispers. At church, I overheard 2 parishioners whispering about me, their voices carrying through the pews. "Poor Aurora, she's losing it. I heard her son is looking into care facilities." I clenched my hands until my nails cut into my palms. Juliet's campaign was working. She was building a narrative where I was the fragile, senile old woman, unfit to make decisions, unfit to live in her own home. My flower shop shifts became my only refuge. Surrounded by the scent of roses and lilies, I could almost pretend to be normal again. But even there, Juliet invaded. One afternoon she appeared unannounced, gliding between the bouquets with that cold smile. "You still working here?" she said loudly, making sure the other clerks could hear. "At your age? It's sweet. But don't you think it's a little sad?" My co-workers looked away, embarrassed, but no one spoke. She left with a bouquet of white lilies she never paid for, tossing me a condescending wave. I walked into the back room, pressed my hands against the counter, and whispered to myself, "How much more can I take?" The answer came sooner than I expected. The invitations for Christmas dinner arrived, handwritten by Juliet herself. When I opened mine, the message was clear. "We expect you at 6 o'clock sharp. Please be respectful of our plans for the evening. Not your son and I, not Ethan, but we." She had replaced me in my own son's life so completely that she spoke for both of them. I considered not going. I considered staying home, locking the door, and sparing myself the inevitable humiliation. But something stronger held me back, pride, perhaps, or the stubborn hope that Ethan might still find his voice. I told myself, maybe it will be different. Maybe Christmas will soften their hearts. But deep down, I knew. The storm was already here. And so, as the lights of the season glowed in every window of the neighborhood, I walked into the lion's den. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, the laughter of children rang out, and yet I felt the weight of 1,000 daggers in every stare. I sat at that table, clutching my napkin, and waited for the final blow. The house was glowing with Christmas lights that night, strings of gold and red blinking against the falling snow. I walked up the steps with my gift tucked under my arm, a modest box wrapped in paper I had saved from the year before. My hands trembled as I rang the bell. I told myself to breathe, to pretend this was just another holiday. But when the door opened, Juliet stood there, radiant in her red dress, her smile sharp as glass. "You're late," she said coldly, even though it was only 6:05. Inside, the dining room shimmered with polished silverware and crystal glasses. The table was laden with turkey, ham, pies. Everything a feast should hold. Children ran across the carpet laughing, their voices bright. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps the warmth of Christmas would soften the edges. Perhaps Ethan would remember who I was to him. But when I took my seat at the far end of the table, I realized the hope was a fool's dream. The conversation flowed easily around me, laughter bouncing between Juliet's parents and her friends. Ethan joined in, smiling politely, raising his glass. yet not once did his eyes meet mine. I sat in silence, my fork poised above my plate, feeling like a shadow at my own family's celebration. It began subtly, as it always did. Juliet glanced at my gift, a small wrapped package, and arched an eyebrow. "Oh, Aurora, still using last year's paper? How quaint." Her voice was sweet, but carried across the table like a whip. A few people chuckled. I felt heat rush to my face, but I forced a smile, pretending I hadn't heard. Moments later, she dropped her fork, letting it clatter loudly. "Ethan, remind me, when was the last time your mother bought herself a new dress? This one looks vintage." The table erupted in muffled laughter. I looked down at the fabric, the simple blue wool I had chosen because it was warm and comfortable. My hands clenched under the table. Ethan laughed weakly, then looked away. The room seemed to close in on me. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the smell of roasted meat, it all turned suffocating. I swallowed hard, willing the tears to stay buried, but Juliet wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "You know, Aurora, maybe it's time you moved into someplace more fitting. An apartment for seniors, maybe? Ethan and I could finally start our life properly in a home with space." The words hung in the air like smoke. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Every pair of eyes turned to me, waiting for my response. My throat felt tight, but I forced myself to speak. "This is my home, my life. You have no right to decide for me." Juliet's smile widened, cruel. "We're only trying to help. But if you can't see that, maybe you shouldn't be here tonight at all." She reached across the table, grabbed my plate, and with a swift motion, dumped it onto the floor. China shattered, gravy splattered across the polished wood, a grotesque echo of the moment, months earlier at her wedding. Gasps filled the room. The children fell silent. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the shards of porcelain glistening at my feet. I looked to Ethan, desperate for him to intervene, to defend me, but he stood slowly, his face pale, his jaw tight. He didn't touch me, didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he said the words that would slice me deeper than any knife. "Mom, you should go." For a moment, I couldn't move. The world spun. The firelight flickered against the walls. The tree lights blurred through my tears. "Go?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "On Christmas?" Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. "You're making things difficult. Please, just go home." The silence was unbearable. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood. My knees trembled as I rose. I searched the faces around the table, hoping, praying for one person to speak up, but no one did. Juliet's parents looked smug. Her friends smirked. Even my own grandchildren stared wide-eyed, too afraid to speak. I walked slowly to the door, each step heavier than the last. Behind me, conversation resumed, forced laughter filling the void, as though nothing had happened, as though I had never been there. When the door closed behind me, the cold night air slapped my face like a punishment. Snowflakes landed on my cheeks, mingling with my tears. I stumbled down the steps, my shoes crunching against the snow. My hands shook violently as I clutched my purse. The Christmas carols drifting from the house felt like a cruel parody. I stood in the driveway, trembling, the bitter wind cutting through my coat, and whispered, "How did it come to this? How did my son become a stranger?" For a moment, I wanted to collapse, to sink into the snow and let it bury me. The loneliness pressed down on me, suffocating. My body shook with sobs I could no longer control. I thought of Robert, my husband gone these many years. I thought of the promise he had made me the day we moved into our apartment. "This will always be your home, Aurora. No one will ever take it from you." His voice echoed in my mind, steady and strong, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Slowly, I wiped the tears from my face, forcing myself to breathe. No, They would not win. They would not erase me. With trembling hands, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My fingers were numb with cold, but I managed to dial the number I had memorized long ago. The line clicked, and a calm voice answered. Collins speaking. "Mr. Collins," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "It's time. Bring the envelope tonight." There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling in the background. Then his voice returned. Steady, cautious. "Aurora, once I come, once this is revealed, there's no going back. Are you certain?" I stared up at the glowing windows of the house, at the silhouettes of people laughing around the table that had once been mine. The sting of humiliation still burned across my face. My son's words, "You should go," echoed in my ears. "I've never been more certain," I whispered. "Very well," he said. 30 minutes. The line went dead. I slipped the phone back into my purse and straightened my spine. The cold no longer bit as sharply. The tears no longer blurred my vision. Something inside me had shifted. They had pushed me out, humiliated me, tried to strip me of my dignity. But they had forgotten one thing. I was not as powerless as I looked. I walked to my old sedan parked at the end of the driveway and sat inside, the worn seat creaking beneath me. I turned the key, letting the heater hum softly, and waited. 30 minutes for my life to change. 30 minutes for them to discover the truth. Through the windshield, I watched the house glow warm and golden, a picture of perfect Christmas cheer. But I knew the cracks had already begun to show. And when Collins arrived with that envelope, the cracks would split wide open, and every carefully constructed lie would come crashing down. I leaned back against the seat, my hands steady now, my breath calm. "Let them laugh," I murmured. "Let them celebrate. They have no idea the storm that's coming." And for the first time in months, I felt something stronger than despair. I felt power. The clock on the dashboard glowed faintly, each minute dragging like an eternity. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat in the car, waiting. For the first time in years, I wasn't trembling from fear but from anticipation. They thought they had thrown me away like an old ornament, fragile and useless, but they had no idea what was about to walk through that front door. Headlights swept across the driveway, blinding for a moment. A dark sedan pulled in behind my battered old car. I opened the door, snow crunching under my shoes, and watched as Collins stepped out. He carried a leather briefcase under his arm, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the glowing house. When he saw me, his eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "Aurora, are you ready?" I nodded, my throat tight. "More than ready." We stood together in the cold for a moment, the silence heavy with everything unspoken. Collins had been my husband's most trusted advisor, the only man who had known the full truth of our finances. Robert had chosen him years ago, warning me that appearances could protect us better than any wall. "Live simply," he used to say, "and let people underestimate you. That's how you keep what's yours safe." And now, those very words would become my weapon. "Once we do this," Collins said carefully, his breath visible in the night air, "you can't undo it. The mask will come off forever. They'll know who you really are." I lifted my chin, gazing at the warm lights of the house that no longer felt like home. "Then let them know. It's time." Collins opened the briefcase under the glow of the street lamp. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, each marked and sealed. He handed me the first one. "This is the suspension of all transfers. As of tonight, Ethan will discover that the lifeline he thought came from bonuses or favors was actually you, and it will be cut." My fingers tightened around the envelope, the weight of it heavier than paper. For 3 years I had carried my son silently, shielding him from the consequences of his reckless spending. Now he would finally stand without my crutch and stumble. The second envelope was larger, heavier. "This contains the amended will," Collins explained. "I followed your instructions exactly. Every asset previously destined for Ethan is redirected. Charities for elder protection, scholarships, and the niece who stood by you. When this is revealed, there will be no question of your intentions." I exhaled slowly, feeling the years of silence peel away. For too long, I had thought protecting Ethan meant protecting the illusion that he was still the boy I raised. But illusions rot when they are built on greed. Collins hesitated, then placed the third envelope in my hands. "And this is the guarantee cancellation for the ballroom. By tomorrow morning, the venue will demand full payment directly from Ethan and Juliet. Without you, they'll have nothing." I traced the seal with my thumb, imagining Juliet's face when her perfect world began to crack. "Good," I whispered. "They should learn what it means to build something without stealing from others." Collins closed the briefcase with a snap. "Aurora, this will be public. Once the documents are read, there is no hiding. Your family, your neighbors, your entire community will know." I looked up at him, my breath steady now. "Then let them know. Let them see who I really am. I've hidden long enough." For the first time since Robert's death, I felt alive. Not the quiet life of compromise and humility, but a sharp, burning fire in my chest. The humiliation of the Christmas table still ached, but now it had transformed into something else. Fuel. Colin studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod of respect. "Very well, shall we?" I looked back at the glowing windows one last time, hearing the muffled laughter drifting out into the cold. My son was in there, celebrating my absence, blind to the storm about to rip through his carefully curated life. I let the anger wash through me one final time, then pushed it aside, leaving only resolve. "Let's go," I said firmly. Together, we began to walk toward the house, our footsteps crunching in the snow. Each step felt like shedding an old skin, no longer the silent mother, no longer the humiliated widow. Tonight, they would meet the real Aurora Hughes, and when the truth burst into their golden celebration, they would understand the price of betrayal. The hallway smelled faintly of pine and candle wax as Collins and I stepped inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around me like a mocking embrace, reminding me of every Christmas past when this place had still felt like family. I could hear the chatter from the dining room, the clink of glasses, the laughter that had returned the moment I walked out into the snow. But before Collins could make his way to the dining room, I touched his arm. "Not yet," I whispered. "I need a moment with my son." He studied me for a beat, then nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the entryway. I followed the muffled sound of footsteps down the hall until I found Ethan in the kitchen. He was pouring himself another glass of wine, his shoulders slumped, his tie loosened. When he looked up and saw me, his face froze. For a moment, guilt flickered across his features, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Mom," he said sharply, setting the bottle down with a thud. "What are you doing here? I told you to go home." I closed the door behind me, the click loud in the silence. My voice trembled at first, but not with fear. With anger I had swallowed too long. "Home? That's what you told me tonight, isn't it? To go home. But tell me, Ethan, which home do you mean? The one you're already planning to sell behind my back?" His jaw tightened. He turned away, staring into his glass. "Juliet just wants what's best for us. For all of us. You're being paranoid." I stepped closer, forcing him to face me. "Paranoid? Do you think I don't know? The real estate agents, the contracts, the whispers at dinner. Do you think I haven't seen the brochures, heard the words you repeat like a parrot? My own son, my only child, plotting to strip me of the only place I have left. And you dare to call me paranoid?" His face flushed, his voice rising. "You don't understand, Mom. You don't know what it's like. The debts, the pressure, the wedding, it's crushing us. Juliet and I, we're drowning." The words cut, but I didn't flinch. And your solution was to drown me with you? I spat. To take my home, the last piece of your father I still have, and call it love? He slammed the glass down on the counter, wine splashing across the marble. His hands shook. What was I supposed to do? We had no other choice. I stepped closer, my eyes burning into his. There is always a choice, Ethan. You could have chosen honesty. You could have chosen to come to me as my son, to admit your struggles, to ask for help. Do you know what I would have done? I would have opened my arms. I would have forgiven. I would have given you everything if you had just looked me in the eyes and said the truth. But you didn't. You chose lies. You chose betrayal. His breath came fast, his shoulders heaving. For the first time, he looked smaller to me. Not the man I had raised, not even the child I once comforted, but a stranger caught in his own web of greed. Mom! His voice cracked, just slightly, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the boy he once was. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. But it did, Ethan. It went exactly that far. Tonight you stood by and watched your wife humiliate me in front of everyone. Tonight you told me to leave as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. Tell me, when did I stop being your mother? When did I become a burden you needed to erase? The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His hands hung limp at his sides, his face pale. I took a deep breath, steadied my voice. Listen to me carefully, Ethan. The woman you think you've destroyed tonight, the fragile, pitiful old mother you cast into the snow, that woman is gone. You will see who I really am. And when you do, you will regret every word, every silence, every betrayal. His eyes widened, confusion flashing across his face. What are you talking about? I turned toward the door, my voice cold and steady. You'll see soon enough. Collins was waiting in the hall, his briefcase in hand. As I stepped out of the kitchen, I didn't look back, but I heard Ethan's voice behind me, softer now, almost pleading. Mom, please. I paused just long enough to let the silence answer him, then walked away. In that moment, the shift was complete. I was no longer the humiliated mother clinging to scraps of dignity. I was the storm, and my son would soon learn what it meant to stand in its path. The dining room shimmered with the golden glow of candles when Collins and I entered together. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, glasses froze halfway to lips, and the sound of forks clinking against porcelain faded into silence. 100 eyes turned toward us. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint notes of a carol playing in the background. Juliet was the first to recover. She shot up from her chair, her red dress glittering under the chandelier. "Aurora!" she snapped, her voice high and sharp. "Didn't Ethan tell you? You're not welcome here tonight. We're trying to celebrate." I didn't answer. Collins stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, and placed his leather briefcase on the table with a deliberate thud. His voice carried across the room, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption. I am Collins, Mrs. Hughes's legal and financial advisor. I have urgent matters that must be addressed with Mr. Ethan Hughes and Mrs. Juliet Dawson." A murmur rippled through the room. Some guests leaned forward eagerly, sensing drama. Others shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind their hands. Juliet's smile faltered, a tremor of unease flashing across her face. Ethan rose slowly, his eyes darting between me and Collins, confusion tightening his features. "What is this?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Mom, what's going on?" Collins opened the first envelope with meticulous care, sliding out a crisp document. "Mr. Hughes, you are hereby notified that the financial guarantee your mother has provided for your lease agreement is canceled, effective immediately. Your landlord will be informed tomorrow morning. Without a new guarantor, you will be required to vacate within 30 days. Gasps erupted around the table. Ethan's face drained of color. "Guarantee?" he stammered. "What guarantee?" I met his eyes at last, my voice steady. "The only reason you kept your apartment this long was because of me. I've been paying silently for years." Juliet's head whipped toward Ethan, panic flashing across her eyes. What is he talking about? Collins didn't wait. He pulled out the second document. Additionally, the monthly transfers of $4,500 to your accounts have been terminated permanently. For the last 3 years, Mrs. Hughes has covered your credit cards, car payments, and various other expenses. As of tonight, that support is over. A collective gasp swept through the room. Juliet staggered back, gripping the edge of the table. "That's impossible!" she shrieked. "Look at her! She works in a flower shop. She drives a car older than me. She doesn't have money." Guests whispered feverishly, their eyes darting between my plain dress and Colin's documents. Phones were raised discreetly, recording. Juliet's hysteria only made her look smaller. Collins lifted the final envelope with a flourish. "Finally, the payment guarantee for this very celebration has been revoked. The ballroom management will require full payment tonight before guests can leave. The total amount owed is $53,000. The words detonated like a bomb. Chairs scraped, glasses toppled. Guests looked around nervously, some rising to gather their coats. The illusion of Juliet's perfect wedding celebration cracked before their eyes, revealing the rot beneath. Ethan's voice broke through the chaos, raw and trembling. "Mom, all this time, it was you?" I took a step forward, my voice calm but resonant. "Yes, Ethan. For 3 years I carried you. I paid your debts, your rent, even your wedding. Every smile you wore, every dinner you hosted, every gift you bought her, it was me. And tonight, I end it." Juliet's scream pierced the silence. "You can't do this. You're a bitter old woman jealous of our happiness. You can't ruin our lives like this." I turned to her, my voice cutting like ice. "I didn't ruin your lives. You did. The moment you raised your hand to me, the moment you mocked me, the moment you plotted to steal my home, you mistook my kindness for weakness. Tonight, you learn the difference." The room buzzed with murmurs, shock and fascination colliding. Some guests nodded in grim approval, others shook their heads in disbelief. Phones captured every second. Collins cleared his throat and unfolded one last paper. There is also the matter of Mrs. Hughes's will. Effective immediately, all assets previously allocated to Mr. Hughes have been redirected. Charitable organizations protecting the elderly, educational scholarships, and the niece who stood by her. Not a cent will pass into the hands of those who conspired against her. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Juliet's knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair, her face pale, her hands clutching her head. Ethan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I looked directly at my son, my voice soft but unyielding. "I loved you, Ethan. I carried you through every storm, but love without respect is poison. Tonight you will live with the choices you made." His eyes brimmed with tears. "Please, Mom, don't do this. There has to be a way." I shook my head. The only way was never to break it in the first place. The room erupted again, some gasping, some applauding, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Juliet sobbed uncontrollably, her perfect night reduced to ashes. Ethan slumped in his chair, hollow, as if the weight of his own decisions had finally crushed him. I straightened my back, feeling the years of humiliation fall away. For the first time in so long, I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the fragile widow they pitied. I was Aurora Hughes, and my dignity was mine again. As Collins closed his briefcase with a decisive snap, I turned to the room, to every guest who had witnessed my humiliation hours before. My voice was steady, calm, and final. This is what happens when you mistake silence for surrender. This is what happens when you trade love for greed. Tonight, you've all seen the truth. Remember it. And with that, I walked out of the dining room, my head high, leaving behind the ruins of their perfect Christmas. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had transformed into a courtroom without walls, a theater of whispers and gasps, where every eye had already judged and every phone camera had already recorded. Juliet's sobs filled the silence, sharp and ragged, while Ethan sat slumped in his chair, his tie hanging loose, his hands trembling. And then, from the back of the room, a voice broke through. "I saw it," Mrs. Bennet, my neighbor, said firmly. She had been sitting quietly among the guests, but now she rose, her face pale with indignation. "I saw Juliet bringing an appraiser to Aurora's building." They walked around with a clipboard, pointing at her apartment as if she were already gone. A murmur rippled across the room. Juliet's head snapped up, her eyes wild. "She's lying. She's just an old woman siding with another old woman." But another voice rose. This time it was my niece, Lucy, her cheeks flushed with anger. "She's not lying. I heard Juliet bragging to her friends that she'd have the apartment before the wedding. She said Aurora wouldn't even fight back. I didn't want to believe it. But now it all makes sense." Gasps erupted again. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some glaring openly at Juliet. She shrieked, "Stop it! You're twisting everything!" But her voice no longer carried the confidence it once had. Then Joseph, my longtime friend and neighbor, stepped forward. His voice was steady, filled with quiet authority. "I've watched Ethan these past months. He barely spoke to me anymore, wouldn't meet my eyes. And I saw Juliet, saw her bringing strangers to the building. Aurora never said a word about it. She suffered in silence until tonight." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests one by one. "You all saw what they did to her. You saw them push her out of her own family table. If that isn't proof enough, I don't know what is." The weight of his words pressed down on the room like a gavel. People nodded. Whispers turned to open condemnation. Phones captured every testimony, every crack in the illusion Juliet had tried to build. Juliet's mother rose, her face ashen, her voice trembling. "This isn't the place." But a man from the staff cut her off, holding up his phone. "The place? This has already gone viral. Look around, everyone's filming. The world is going to see this." I glanced at the glowing screens, faces illuminated in blue light, fingers tapping furiously. Within hours, perhaps even minutes, my humiliation would be transformed into something else. Evidence. Evidence of what greed looks like when it masquerades as family. Collins leaned closer to me, his voice low. "It's no longer a private matter, Aurora. This has become something bigger." And I knew he was right. My pain was no longer confined to the walls of this house. It was spilling into the world, into living rooms and phones, into hearts that had felt the same betrayal. Juliet buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Ethan looked at me, broken, his lips trembling as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. The witnesses had spoken, the guests had seen. The cameras had captured. What began as my humiliation had ignited into something much larger, a fire that would not be put out, not tonight, not ever. I stood taller, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. For once, I wasn't the only voice in the room. Others had carried the truth forward, and in doing so, they had made sure this story would not be buried. The night ended not with music or laughter, but with chaos. Guests left in small groups, their murmurs cutting sharper than knives. Some shook my hand before leaving, whispering, "You did the right thing." Others simply stared at Ethan and Juliet with thinly veiled disgust, their once perfect image shattered like glass. By the time the last car had pulled away, the ballroom felt hollow, its glittering decorations now a cruel reminder of a celebration that had collapsed into scandal. The very next morning, the consequences began to unfold. The manager of the ballroom arrived at Juliet's door with a formal demand for payment. $53,000, non-negotiable. Without my guarantee, their credit cards declined, their bank accounts empty, they had no way to pay. Word spread quickly. Vendors pulled their services, photographers canceled, and caterers demanded advance payment for what was already served. Their dream wedding was declared void, their debts multiplied overnight. Juliet's family, once smug in their superiority, distanced themselves almost immediately. Her parents whispered excuses to neighbors, pretending they had no idea what their daughter had done. But everyone knew. Videos of the confrontation had already spread online, racking up thousands of views. Headlines appeared within days. Mother humiliated at Christmas dinner exposes son and daughter-in-law's greed. Juliet's face, once painted with triumph, became a symbol of shame. For Ethan, the downfall was even sharper. His employer, embarrassed by the public scandal, quietly terminated his contract. No company wanted the man who let his mother be thrown out in the snow while he stood silent. Former friends turned away, unwilling to be associated with betrayal. The phone calls that once filled his days went silent. The boy I had raised, the man I had protected, found himself utterly alone, except for the woman who had led him there, and even she had begun to crack under the weight of disgrace. As for me, the world that had once looked at me with pity now looked at me with respect. Neighbors stopped me in the hallway to say, "You were brave, Aurora." The women at the flower shop hugged me tightly, their eyes shining. Even strangers on the street nodded, some whispering, "That's her, the one who stood up." For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of dignity returning, not as something I had to beg for, but as something I had earned, back with fire. But perhaps the most powerful moment came a week later. I received a letter from the court clerk, confirming that Juliet's attempts to paint me as senile, incapable, unfit to manage my life had collapsed. The testimonies from witnesses, the evidence Collins had compiled, the viral videos, all of it had obliterated her case before it even reached the judge's bench. Instead of questioning my competency, the court ordered an investigation into their attempts at manipulation and coercion. Suddenly, the threat that had hung over my head for months had turned back on them. Their punishment wasn't prison, not yet, but it was worse in some ways. Public humiliation, financial ruin, legal debts they could not pay. Every door that once opened for them now slammed shut. Juliet, once the glittering bride, avoided the grocery store, too ashamed to face the stairs. Ethan, once so proud, walked the streets with his head bowed. And me? I sat once again in my apartment, the place they had tried to strip from me, surrounded by the quiet peace of survival. The Christmas tree twinkled softly in the corner, its lights reflecting in the window. I sipped my tea and breathed deeply, feeling something I hadn't in years: freedom. Not just freedom from their schemes, but freedom from silence, from invisibility, from fear. For too long I had believed I had to endure. That love meant sacrifice without limit. But betrayal has a way of teaching lessons sharper than any blade. And the lesson was this: I was never powerless. I had only forgotten my strength. 2 weeks after that disastrous Christmas night, I found myself sitting once more by the window of my apartment, the place they had tried so desperately to erase me from. Outside, snow still blanketed the streets, muffling the noise of the city, but inside, there was peace. The silence no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like freedom. My tree still stood in the corner, its lights twinkling softly, not for anyone else, not for guests or for show, but for me. For the first time in years, I decorated it alone and smiled while doing so. Each ornament carried a memory, not of humiliation, but of resilience. The paper star my son had made when he was a child, the silver bell Robert had bought on our first Christmas together, the angel that had always watched from the top. They were mine, reminders of a love and dignity that could never be stolen, no matter how cruel the betrayal. Life began to bloom again in small but powerful ways. Neighbors knocked to bring me food, not out of pity, but out of solidarity. Letters arrived, slipped under my door, from strangers who had seen the video and written, "You gave me courage. I finally told my children no." At the flower shop, customers smiled knowingly, saying, "We saw you, Aurora. You stood tall." Their words filled the air like perfume, healing the wounds that had been carved so deep. And within myself, something shifted forever. I no longer lowered my eyes in shame. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I had faced betrayal in its cruelest form, and I had answered not with silence, but with truth. The weight of humiliation was gone, replaced by the armor of dignity. Ethan and Juliet remained in the shadows of disgrace, their names whispered with pity, not respect. Yet I did not gloat. A strange calmness lived in me now. They had chosen their path, and they would walk it without me. My heart mourned the son I had lost, but it also celebrated the woman I had rediscovered. I could not save him from his choices, but I could save myself. On New Year's Eve, I lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. Its flame flickered against the dark night, small but unwavering. I thought of Robert, of the life we had built, of the promise he had whispered so long ago. Dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you give it away. At last I understood. I turned off the television that night without watching the fireworks. I didn't need explosions in the sky to mark a new beginning. The spark was already inside me. And as I sat there, I wondered, how many others are sitting in silence right now, believing they must endure humiliation in the name of family? How many mothers, fathers, grandparents are being told they are a burden while their sacrifices are quietly consumed? So I will ask you, the one listening to my story, if it were you at that Christmas table, if your own child told you to leave, would you walk away in silence? Or would you stand, as I did, and reclaim the dignity that is rightfully yours? Because dignity is not a gift given by others. It is not a luxury, not a decoration to be taken down when it no longer suits them. Dignity is the core of who we are, and it must be protected, fiercely, unapologetically. My name is Aurora Hughes. I am a mother, a widow, a woman who was humiliated, betrayed, and cast out into the snow. But I am also the woman who stood back up, who faced her betrayers, and who walked away, not broken, but whole. And if my story has touched you, if you see a piece of your own struggle in mine, then let us not stay silent. Share it. Speak it. Write it. Leave me a comment. Tell me, from which city are you listening, and what would you have done in my place? If you believe that no one, no matter their age, should ever be stripped of their dignity, then let your voice be heard. Like this story, subscribe for the next one, because together we can remind the world that respect is not optional, it is owed. The candle in my window burned late into the night, steady and strong. And so did I.